Jeremy Meyer from the Denver Post joins us. A great story you wrote recently on the editorial pages of Ethan Saylor. Give us the basic part of this, because this was a powerful story.
So about a year ago, in fact, exactly a year ago, this guy, he had Down syndrome. He was in his mid-20s. He went to go see a movie. It was actually when the Broncos were playing the Ravens in that playoff game. His mom stayed behind to watch that game. She's a Ravens fan. He went to the game.
This was out in Maryland.
It was in Maryland. It was in Baltimore.
So makes sense.
Yeah. So he goes to his cinema that he always goes to. It's in a mall. He has a 19-year-old aide with him. He watches Zero Dark 30, enjoys it so much, he wants to see it again. But they were leaving, and they left the theater, and he decides he wants to go back in and see the movie. He goes into the theater without paying to go in and see the movie. The theater manager stops the aide and says he can't do that, and he calls the sheriff's deputy. There's two or three sheriff's deputies who were working as off-duty cops. They show up, and the aide says, "Let me deal with this. He'll get freaked out. Let's just wait him out."
And this is someone with Down syndrome, right. So he has mental disabilities. Yeah. He's delayed, and he wants to go back and watch the movie. So he goes and sits down to watch the movie again. Right. And the cop's response was ridiculous.
Yeah.
What did they do?
Well, I think in any kind of normal circumstance, their response probably wouldn't be seen as ridiculous. They went in and said, "Sir, you have to leave." And he says, "No, I want to watch the movie again." And they said, "No, you got to leave." And the aide tells the deputies, "Just don't touch him. He really hates to be touched." The deputies touched him, and he flips out. He curses at them. He says, "I'm not leaving." The aides or the deputies grab him and cuff him, wrestle him to the ground, and he dies. He stops breathing on the ground. He's has a deputy on top of him. An autopsy later determines that his larynx was crushed, and he asphyxiated.
Let's bring this forward. You have a beautiful daughter who has Down syndrome. I've got a very, very naughty son who has Down syndrome.
I know, I've met him.
And when I look at these kids, even I notice that these kids look different.
Right.
How is it that a police officer or a sheriff's deputy, does this and doesn't see that this is a person with a handicap?
Yeah, that's clearly the problem there. They didn't. I'm sure they noticed his difference, but they didn't. I guess they didn't treat him any differently. They just expected him to follow the orders, and they said, "You're going to jail." And meanwhile, his mom is driving to the theater. The aide is outside saying, "Just let me deal with it. I can get him out of there, or we can, buy him a ticket."
Right.
I mean, so my article was, people need to get training. Law enforcement, even bus drivers,
Well, especially people in those areas, because I hope someday that our kids become mobile enough to ride a public bus or to take a taxi cab. Right. I don't think my son will ever be driving, but I hope people understand how to integrate people like our children into a different society. Let me take a different tact. This is a tragic story, and it makes me angry, and it scares me. It's got to scare you too.
Yeah.
Anybody who's a parent of a Downs kid has got to be frightened by this. But at the same time, is there a reason for us to be optimistic? And this is what I mean. 20 years ago, you wouldn't have had this story because people like our children wouldn't be going to movies out in public.
Right.
They would still be in some sort of institution. Right. They wouldn't be mainstreamed enough that they would be walking around the general population. Now we're getting to the point where they are being introduced to that, right. And this is part of that problem of integrating that because people don't quite understand.
Exactly. You're right. I mean, they're kids with Down syndrome, kids with autism, which is, a growing population, they're not being warehoused. They're not being taken out of society. They're actually being included in society. And, it's difficult to say, well, society has to adjust. Well, actually, society does have to adjust. And so do, our kids. We have to teach them, ways to respect authority, ways to respect if a cop comes. But there's a point.
It's difficult to do. I mean, you've met my son. You've got a beautiful daughter. Your daughter actually speaks very well. My son is for the most part still at 9 years old nonverbal. He can say a few words, but he's not going to be understood. I can understand him, but and so he's not going to fit in. I don't know how I can train him to fit in. I can do my very best, and sometimes, I don't know about your daughter, my son, when he gets a wild hair, there is no stopping him. I could see him in that exact same situation in the movie theater going, no, I'm staying here.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I'm imagining your daughter has those same fits.
Right.
What is it that police need to know first, and then let's back off. And then I want to talk, when we have a little time here, about civil liberties, and do our children have the same rights and freedoms that other people do?
Yeah.
And if so, how does that manifest? Because let's be honest, this is a problem. No movie theater wants this problem.
No.
No cab driver wants this problem. They didn't invite this into their lives, but there it is.
There's a training called CIT, Crisis Intervention Training, which they're trying to train officers to recognize people with differences, people with mental health issues, people with Down syndrome, people with autism, and recognize, and maybe you don't have to jump in, and grab and cuff and, get them out of there. You need to, in many ways, start figuring out how to communicate with the person. And sometimes that means just backing off, If it doesn't have to be, if it's not like a crisis, I mean, this movie could have waited 5 minutes and this guy would have been out of there. You didn't have to wrestle him out. So there is a training that does that, and lots of Colorado officers have gotten that training. I mean, it needs to be more and more. Maryland, where this happened, the governor spoke to the parents, and there was a online campaign for them to do something about this, to either fire those officers or make changes. And the governor says, okay, we're going to do that. He hired Tim Shriver, who's JFK's nephew, who's the head of Special Olympics, to head this panel. And they just came out with recommendations looking at best practices around the country of what agencies and law enforcement does with people with disabilities and differences. And they've come up with a model. And we hope that happens, across the country, because this is going to be more and more of a problem. People with disabilities and differences are in our midst, and we have to incorporate them and include them.
I think about it, if you and I had these same children 50 years ago, 30 years ago, they wouldn't have the lifespan that they do now. Medical advances. I mean, the average age for a Downs person to live was in their 20s. I mean, it was heartbreaking. At the same time, they were shut away somewhere. They were institutionalized. They were put out there, not to be seen, not to be looked at. And what a shame, because my son's a joy, and I mean, he brings me more joy than I can imagine. But I understand that it's hard for other people who haven't. It took me a long time to get adjusted to being around someone with Down syndrome. I can imagine for somebody who this is completely new, that this is a hurdle.
Yeah, it is. But I mean, I think if they're in those positions where they're interacting with the public all the time, they're going to see this. Probably not everybody, but actually officers are probably going to encounter more people with mental illness than most people are, and they just have to get that training, and I think they are. I know Denver, after Paul Childs, you remember that incident with a kid with a developmental disability was shot by an officer. Hickenlooper put in the independent monitor to look at these situations, and also put in he wanted to grow the number of officers with CIT training, and he did. It has fallen off because that was training that was put in when officers were going through the academy, and there's been a lag of officers going through the academy because we haven't hired many for a long time.
Again, our kids show physical signs of their developmental delay. I mean, you see it, you go, that's a kid with Downs.
Right.
It's obvious.
Sure.
You look at a kid with autism, and that's a
I
huge
know.
spectrum. Some of them are remarkably functional and just have an odd characteristic here and there, and some of them really have a difficulty communicating at all.
Right.
I wouldn't know that just by looking at,
Right.
at someone. And all sorts of mental illnesses I wouldn't know just by looking at
right.
someone.
You know, I talked to a father who has a kid with autism, and he went to a theater with him. And the kid's about 13, 14 years old. The dad goes to the bathroom, leaves the son in the lobby, and the son starts getting nervous. And kids with autism sometimes do this thing called flapping, and he started to flap. And the father came out of the bathroom, and he saw the manager starting to come around to the kid, wondering what's going on. And he saw the whole thing unfolding almost the same way it would have happened with Ethan, and it petrified him, fearing, that could happen with his kid. I mean, it could happen with our kids. It's scary.
It's petrifying, I mean, for you and I. All right, so taking this away, I understand from police training, I understand it from fire and rescue. I can see it for the bus drivers and people where you're more likely to see people like our kids. But that manager at the theater you just mentioned, he's getting paid his $8 an hour, and there is not a training program for that kid. He just sees somebody starting to freak out in a movie theater.
Yeah.
He's thinking about the Aurora shooting. He's thinking about all sorts of weird stuff. This guy, how does he get the message?
I don't know. I think it's just, as our kids get more included in schools, in society and work, people start employing, our kids, maybe not to, do really tough jobs, but maybe some work. As people are around people with differences, disabilities, Down syndrome, autism, they're going to learn that, there are people with differences. And I just think the more our kids are included in society, I think it's going to take some time, but I think it's going to become...
I think it's going to be older people who have a harder problem with it. I look at kids who are in school with my son, and it's not like when we were kids. I mean, he's just another buddy on the playground who's a little different. Jeremy, thank you so much. A great article. Go online, check it out, Denver Post, and talk to your neighbors about it. Listen for me on 630 KHOW, and by all means, check out the Independence Institute, independenceinstitute.org. We'll see you next week.